and welcome to Global 360, the webcast produced by the Washington Diplomat, which has been the premier source of information for the diplomatic community here in Washington, D.C. for over 25 years. And we want to send a thank you to our sponsor, Sahori Insurance, which has been serving the diplomatic community for over 50 years. I am the Diplomat's managing editor, Anna Gawel, and I want to welcome my co-host, political analyst, Eric Ham. Hello, Eric.
Welcome, everyone. Good to see you, Anna.
Good to see you. So now, our last few webcasts, we have, of course, focused on the coronavirus pandemic, understandably, because this is collectively the biggest crisis that the entire planet is facing. But there are other problems that the world has been facing for years that have not magically disappeared because of coronavirus. And it's been an interesting phenomenon because the pandemic has both caused these problems to be overlooked in addition to exacerbating these issues. And I think this also gets to the other phenomenon of how the pandemic will fundamentally redefine globalization as we know it. And we don't know exactly what it will do years from now, but certainly it'll reshape the concept of globalization. But at the same time, as I think you'll hear with some of the examples that we'll talk about today, they show that regardless, we will continue to be inextricably interconnected in this world, whether we like it or not. And as an example, I wanted to start with probably, though, ironically, the most disconnected country in the world, which is North Korea. I almost think you could say it's hermetically sealed. And I think we've seen that in recent weeks where rumors have swirled that Kim Jong-un died after possible heart surgery. Now, it's been revealed that he is apparently alive and well in a beach resort, if all reports are true. And reportedly because he was attempting to avoid catching the coronavirus. So I think what's astonishing about this is that for weeks, the world, and that includes, as far as we know, U.S. intelligence agencies and other agencies all around the world, had no idea if this man was alive or dead. And he runs a country with an estimated 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. And I think it really illustrated how absolutely in the dark so much of us are when it comes to North Korea and how absolutely dangerous that scenario is. I mean, it has brought up the issue of, is the country in the midst of a pandemic? We have no idea. The only advantage to, I guess, the world is that the borders are completely sealed. So it's not as if we're going to get a tourist from North Korea going somewhere else. But at the same time, exports have been cut off. There could be a huge amount of, even more misery for the population if there is an outbreak taking place. It could destabilize the regime. What is the secession plan if Kim dies or is overthrown? A lot of experts say that if there's a regime collapse, it's going to happen very quickly. Who will secure those nuclear weapons? And then you have a health crisis on top of that. So, I think the example of North Korea shows that we cannot ignore these fundamental global crises that existed before the pandemic. And something you haven't heard of is ever since the Hanoi summit with President Trump and Kim Jong-un, which was in early 2019, there has been no progress on the nuclear front with North Korea. And in fact, there's a lot of reports that the country is expanding its ballistic missile program. So we're going in the opposite direction. And I think so coronavirus in this way has obviously overshadowed what is brewing in North Korea that we're not aware of. And there's a certain parallel of even before the pandemic, North Korea was itself overshadowed by another similar crisis, which is Iran's nuclear program. Even though Iran has no confirmed nuclear weapons, unlike North Korea. So this is something we've regularly been covering in the Washington Diplomat newspaper. And as most people know, you have the Obama era nuclear deal from 2015 that, by most accounts, lessened the breakout period that it would take for Iran to develop a nuclear bomb. It put limits on the program, varied in phases of up to 15 years. And then, of course, President Trump ditched the plan in 2018 in favor of a maximum pressure campaign that has choked off Iran's oil-based economy. And in 2019, we saw a series of oil tanker skirmishes. There were protests inside the country that were, again, hidden from the public. A lot of people on the outside did not know exactly how many people died in those protests. And then at the end of the year, you had the US killing of Qasem Soleimani, a major military figure in Iran. So we were very close to a direct confrontation. Iran retaliated on US-owned military bases in Iraq. But a huge confrontation was averted. But I did an interesting profile of Michelle Flournoy, who was a top Pentagon official during the Obama administration. And she made a point that a lot of officials make, which is Iran does not usually retaliate right away. It sits back and bides its time for the right time to retaliate when people are not necessarily expecting it. And to me, that led to the question of, I wonder, obviously Iran was hit very hard with coronavirus, but it seems like the numbers now have been going back down. And certainly there is a concern that perhaps they will take advantage of the world and the US being distracted by the pandemic to perhaps retaliate at the moment. And I think it's enough of a concern that you've seen Congress in recent weeks make an effort to constrain the president's ability to undertake any military action against Iran. But that ability was vetoed by the president just recently. And so, Eric, you are eyes and ears on Congress, even though it's empty, you're still following everything going on there. What are some of your thoughts, and tell us about this War Powers Act that was recently vetoed?
Yeah, sure. But I want to go back and just say a few quick words about what you talked about regarding North Korea. And what I actually think regarding the coronavirus is I think it actually highlights the limits of these talks, this relationship between President Trump and Kim, because given that now the United States is and the world is experiencing this pandemic, and there was a time when we did not know where he was, if Kim was alive or dead, and we have heard President Donald Trump speak about this relationship that he now has with Kim, and also he says that if he were not the president of the United States would be at war with North Korea. To suggest that because he is the president now, there is some type of bond, there's some type of relationship that suggests that there's a different direction that the United States and North Korea are now on. But when Kim was out of sight and there was this speculation that perhaps he was dead, you would think that this would be the time when the president would be able to call on that relationship, and that he would know something that perhaps we didn't know, or even his own intelligence community.
You know,
right, exactly. But I mean, what I thought it highlighted the limits of these meetings, these summits that the president has been having with Kim, and also I think it speaks to, again, the amount of deftness and savvy that Kim has been playing, you know, in terms of biding for time, whatever that time is that he may be using it for, because we don't really see any discernible difference between U.S.-North Korea relations. Because again, for a president to claim to have such an amazing relationship, something that's 180 to what we have seen from other U.S. presidents and other North Korean leaders, this time I think it still speaks to where it's much the same as it always has been. Right. Because again, President Trump had no idea where he was. Now,
yeah, it's almost like a pattern of, you know, of the photo ops, of the talk, and then the issue fades. And right. There's, you know, not much, the details, the devil's always in the details.
Right, exactly. And once again, you've got the United States relying on its intelligence community. What do we know in terms of what South Korea knows? Or better yet, what is China hearing? Because again, President Donald Trump simply isn't read in. And now getting back to Iran, you're right. Congress has only been back to half strength. We saw the Senate actually return this week, but the president vetoed this War Powers resolution. And it's interesting because this resolution actually passed the Senate back in 2019. And the president is only now getting around to vetoing that. And of course, one of the reasons for that is because of so much attention and effort now being placed on the pandemic. But before that, you had a president that was dealing with an impeachment process. So now the president is now focusing again on these issues. And now we see the president vetoing this legislation, and then Congress attempting once again to override that veto. It's also just a quick history note for those who are watching. The United States has only had 111 successful veto overrides in its history. So if this had actually gone through, this would have been the 112th. So these are not actually common occurrences where you have veto overrides. But you're right, this was legislation that actually got support from Republicans and Democrats who actually went along with this resolution to actually curb the president's ability to engage in Iran. And also, the president has signed a total of 7 vetoes since he's been in office, and 5 of them have dealt with issues relating to the Middle East. Vetoes of his war powers resolution, both in Iran and with Yemen. And there was another resolution that was vetoed that surrounded the issue of Jamal Khashoggi as well. So clearly what we see here is while Republicans typically stand with President Donald Trump on just about anything, it seems as though the kryptonite of this president might be his handling of foreign policy, particularly when it relates to the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. And it's been interesting on that note, with, as you said, it's largely dealt with the Middle East, and there's been a strong bipartisan, rare consensus against America's traditional ally, Saudi Arabia. And in addition to the Khashoggi murder, a huge reason for it has been the war in Yemen. And here again, we get to a crisis that's been overlooked for years, long before the pandemic. Yemen was already the poorest country in the Arab world before Saudi Arabia put together a coalition to start a bombing campaign after Houthi rebels backed by Iran ousted the internationally recognized and Saudi-backed government. So this was now exactly 5 years ago. We've been covering the issue throughout the civil war, and the UN has declared it for a long time now the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And our correspondent, Jonathan Gorvit, we have an article that just came out talking about how you have this, what was already the world's worst humanitarian situation, compounded by the possibility of coronavirus in a country where the health system, has been decimated. And what's interesting here is, by some estimates, the war over 5 years has cost 100,000 lives. There have been, over the last year, 100,000 cases of cholera. Now imagine, on top of that, coronavirus. And I mean, it's almost, as aid experts, it's almost unimaginable. Now, there was a kind of a silver lining to this, which is Saudi Arabia has been a lot of pressure under Congress, internationally as well, to get out of this war. It's been 5 years. There hasn't been much progress. So it did offer, in light of coronavirus, a temporary ceasefire. Now, the Houthi rebels have rejected that on the grounds that they want more demands, such as lifting of the Saudi coalition's air and sea blockades. They are also gaining militarily at the moment while the coalition is fragmenting. So it doesn't really make sense for them, strategy-wise, at the moment, to accept a ceasefire. But the hope is that peace is ironically could be possible, because coronavirus would give both warring sides an excuse to save face and offer a deal in the name of preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. Now, whether that happens, we'll see. As of our article, there has not been progress on that front. And unfortunately, the concern, not just Yemen, but the entire region, we have had problems that have been festering for years. I mean, Syria continues to be at a virtual stalemate, although, Assad is firmly in power now. So you still have millions of refugees that continue to sit in refugee camps in Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq. These countries were already under a tremendous amount of strain because of the refugee issue. If coronavirus ignites in these camps, you can only imagine the potential devastation. And, in a refugee camp, social distancing is not exactly an option. You can't exactly wash your hands if there's a lack of water. And at the moment, the world has 70 million people displaced from their homes. And I have a bunch of numbers here because I'm a geek when it comes to numbers, but they're staggering, and they really reveal a picture that I think that many people think has been widely overlooked. The pandemic could, for the first time in 2 decades, reverse progress in terms of global poverty. The World Bank estimates that 500 million people could be plunged into poverty because of the coronavirus. And I think specifically, it could wipe out the tremendous gains that Africa has made over the last quarter century. And this is becoming an issue that's getting on people's radar. For now, fortunately, we have not seen many cases in Africa. And there is some good news. I mean, when they had the 2014 Ebola crisis, many countries like Liberia began to institute very strong pandemic preparedness systems. You had countries like South Africa, Rwanda, they've responded in a very prompt way. But at the same time, you have a continent that overall poverty is an enormous issue. You cannot quarantine people when it's mostly rely on an informal economy, because you could be sentencing them to starvation. So obviously, self-isolation is simply not an option in many countries. And so many African leaders have been lobbying global institutions for debt relief. Now, they've received some of it. The multilateral institutions have agreed to suspend debt payments until the end of this year and possibly later. But a lot of African leaders are arguing that they need more debt relief, that they need possibly debt forgiveness. And Rwandan President Kagame, he estimated that the continent could need $100 billion in support if the pandemic hits full force. And now this seems like a large number, but it's actually similar to a top UN official estimated that overall, less developed countries will need about $90 billion in aid to begin to even just deal and weather the pandemic. The UN has set up a $2 billion response fund so far. And just to give you an idea of how much of that has been filled, $1 billion. So now you're looking at, we need 90 to $100 billion to help the developing world at a minimum weather this crisis. So far, $1 billion has been pledged. So, this kind of gives you a preview of what possibly is going to be an enormous issue. And compare that, they do sound like large figures, obviously $100 billion, but governments around the world have already pledged $8 trillion in economic stimulus spending, including, of course, here in the US. So, this gets to, do we kind of an us versus them in terms of globalization? And I think the EU recognizes a bit of this urgency because they, of course, had the refugee crisis on their doorsteps in 2015. So they recently spearheaded a fundraising conference, and they raised about $8 billion from other governments and private entities to fund a global vaccine. But if you think about that $8 billion, the main country that did not participate was the United States. Now, the Trump administration has said that it is already devoting billions of dollars to developing a vaccine here at home, and that it is coordinating with other governments, including those in the EU, in terms of developing the vaccine. But it's only natural that there are questions. If we develop a vaccine, how much global cooperation will there be if one is finally developed? And I think that's one of the biggest questions you get to in terms of globalization. And I think the biggest question that we see this, or the biggest problem area where we see this, and the most acute example of it, is China. Because this has obviously been an area where President Trump has chosen confrontation over cooperation. And the world has become very split on this issue of US-China blame game. And it's really taken up a lot of the bandwidth in terms of battling coronavirus. So, Eric, after my long spiel on with my numbers that I gathered here, let's switch gears and talk specifically about where we are on this kind of US-China battle of wills on the pandemic front.
Sure. I just want to go back and just touch on something that you said, particularly as it relates to Africa, because we're seeing global economies contract as a result of this virus. In fact, China is also seeing that as well. And when we look at the economies and now how all economies are struggling, what we're seeing is we cannot discount the price of oil and how oil rich nations are really going to be impacted by this. And when you're talking about Africa, you cannot talk about Africa and talk about oil prices and not talk about Nigeria and how this problem could really exacerbate, which is now increasingly, Nigeria is now the most populous nation in sub-Saharan Africa. And now we've got this oil crisis, which means this is a largely oil producing nation. And I think that's going to only exacerbate the problem when you talk about, an oil-rich nation, a populous nation, and now oil prices have completely tanked. And so what impact will that have? And I think it only doubles the problem for them. So I think that's one part of it. But also I think when we're talking about China, you're right, this tit for tat between the United States and China is only growing. But I do believe China recognizes that there's an opportunity for them. And we know China has been pumping billions of dollars into Africa. And I think they will see this as an opportunity for them, even though they are in this war of words with the United States. They will certainly, I think, use this opportunity for them to actually continue to increase their presence on the global stage, while at the same time we're seeing the United States retreat from the global stage. But that certainly is not going to stop the United States from attempting to attack China. And we're actually seeing that now. Just this week, the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, announced the China Task Force. And this is a task force that is largely made up of House Republicans. And its sole purpose is to lead investigations into China and attempt to basically find ways to not curry favor with China, but to increase that level of enmity and animosity with China, because they see China as a threat. In fact, there was a memo that came out by the Republican National Committee on the political front, where they want their members now who are running for office in 2020 to continue to bash China, saying that China is the culprit for this COVID-19. China is the reason for this pandemic, and it's because of China that the United States is struggling with this pandemic. And if in fact Americans criticize or have questions about how the administration has handled this virus, these candidates that are running for office are to, again, turn their direction back to China. So what we're seeing here is basically the beginnings of a fight that is not just about how do we address this pandemic, but also it's becoming increasingly political. And now what we're seeing is the Republicans are going to use this as a tool to maintain power. And also President Donald Trump is going to use it as a vehicle to perhaps benefit his reelection effort.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that too, I have some figures because that's what I do. But, the narrative is taking hold. There was a Pew Research poll that just came out where now 2/3 of Americans view China unfavorably versus I believe about a year ago, it was 47%. So certainly this narrative is taking hold. And, as critics have pointed out, it is a good vehicle to deflect blame from. Certainly both sides had a delayed reaction. Now, with China, the issue is more of the lack of transparency and knowing what they were dealing with and hiding it for a certain amount of time. I think there are legitimate also articles out there that point out that China, just like any other country, has an enormous bureaucracy, where a lot of the bureaucrats, for instance, in Wuhan, where the virus originated, didn't probably necessarily want to, or didn't know, it had to go up so many levels of chains of command. And you don't want to, as an official, make your bosses angry in the Communist Party. So there's probably some reluctance there. There was probably some legitimate reluctance not to start a panic about a virus that they were not familiar with, and maybe, you know, might not have developed into anything. So there was probably some of that that came into play. But at the same time, you clearly have what most reports show, they have underreported the crisis, the numbers, and, you know, what could be staggering ways. And there were very critical lapses of time where between December and about mid-January to the third week, where the world lost a precious amount of time. And so certainly there are investigations that need to be had. I think the issue is twofold. Do you first put out a fire and then investigate what caused the fire? And I think that is what China is saying. And there are a lot of other countries that agree we need to focus right now and we need to cooperate to put out the fire for now. You know, Republicans have said they do not want to, they don't want to give in to Democratic demands to include Trump in the investigation in terms of the response. They want it to stay focused on China because they don't want it devolving into an impeachment-like political circus. But at the same time, you know, if you're going to investigate delayed responses, we do need to look inward. We had a delay of roughly 2 months as well. So it will be interesting to see how much self-reflection there will be versus blaming that there will be. And I highly doubt it will be the end of it. And in fact, kind of on the local front, Republicans just recently announced that they want to push a measure through to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy here in Washington, D.C., in the Van Ness neighborhood, in honor of Dr. Li Wenliang, who he was the Wuhan doctor among a small group that really sounded the alarm early on about the coronavirus. The Chinese government, he was reprimanded, and unfortunately, of course, his predictions came to be true, and he, in February, died of COVID-19. So he's been made to be a hero, and if the street is renamed, I'm sure that will not exactly do much to cool tensions, unfortunately.
Not at all.
No. But not all is bad news. I wanted to end, since we're talking on the local front, another development that again has been overshadowed. So Sudan, which last year got rid of decades of authoritarian rule by Omar al-Bashir, there were protests and uprising that wound up, actually, the government, the military did not crush. They have formed a transitional government. There are hopes, of course it's very fragile, but there are hopes that democracy could, after decades, take hold in Sudan. And just recently, it was announced that Sudan has appointed its very first ambassador to the US in over 2 decades. And this was following an outreach late last year by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. So we will see. Obviously, if a country like Sudan is hit by the coronavirus, unfortunately, all bets are off. But there are a lot of bright spots and a lot of developments that continue to happen in spite of the pandemic. And we'll be covering both good and bad, mostly bad, I think, but we'll try and get some good in there. But I do have more good. So we have our, not so great transition, but so as we do at the end of every webcast, we have a cultural corner where we highlight what embassies, museums, and other institutions here in DC are doing to expand their cultural offerings to people at home and getting into the virtual world. So now the European Union, the delegation of the European Union to the US, they hold every year this very popular annual open house weekend in May. Of course, you know, going thousands of people in bulk to an embassy is not an option at the moment. So, but they're doing a virtual event called #HomeWithEU. It's an all-day festival on May 9th. Now, in case you missed it, they are continuing the event with a series of online concerts. It's going to be cooking classes, virtual tours of museums, and lots of other activities you can do online that showcase the kind of heritage and culture of each EU member states. So that will be available all throughout May at www.euopenhouse.org. And we're also going to have all this information on our website, washdiplomat.com. And I think what's going to be interesting is it includes a virtual dialogue between artists from the US and Austria for this project called No Place Like the Future, which imagines what a post-corona future will look like. So again, I don't know if that's the most positive discussion, but it's what we have to all adapt to, obviously, and this is partly what that future will look like. So again, continuing, everything's digital now. There's also, similar to the EU Open House, Passport DC opens the doors in May to dozens of embassies. And one of the highlights of the festival is something called the National Asian Heritage Festival, which is a great parade and all kinds of fun activities. But since it can't be done in person this year, they're hosting something called Fiesta Asia 2020. And it's going to feature an 8-part online event series throughout May. And the programs cover a lot of different things. It's going to be cultural performances, highlights of notable historical figures, everyday heroes, cooking demos, trivia, education, all kinds of fun stuff to keep you busy at home about Asian heritage. So you can check that out at fiestaasia.org, or again, on our website. There's another kind of local hidden cultural gem that we often write about, which is the Art Museum of the Americas. And they're the cultural arm of the OAS, the Organization of American States. And they host many exhibits, and they've recently gone digital with hashtag AMA at home. And there's going to be an exhibition called Liquid City 41. I don't know what the 41 stands for, I won't lie, but it sounds really cool. And it's going to bring together a Canadian and a Brazilian artist and kind of capture their photographs of different cities that they showcase in their work. So sounds pretty cool. And finally, Cinetic Theater, which is a very innovative theater group in Arlington. They're the ones that do the kind of no words, movement based plays on Shakespeare, which, I don't know how you do a wordless Shakespeare play, but they've managed to do it successfully for many years. And so they're obviously at the forefront of innovation. So they've put together a digital adaptation of an Italian play called The Decameron, in which artists will adapt one story from the work remotely and present it in a final piece for streaming in June. So you've got plenty of time to check it out. Now, The Decameron, excuse me, is a collection of Italian novellas written in response to the Black Plague. So it's not the most uplifting of topics during these times, but there's an interesting quote by Cinetic's founding director, and he said, "I've been going stir crazy and feeling sad and not creating and collaborating." Oops, kind of ruined the momentum of my quote. I'll start over. So he said, "I've been going stir crazy, as a lot of us have, and feeling sad by not creating and collaborating. And now with this project, I'm feeling alive again." So, somewhat positive note, the creativity goes on. Unfortunately, the problems go on in this world, but as you can see, everyone is adapting and doing the best that they can, and there's still a lot going on the positive front. So we will talk about all of that in future webcasts. We'll talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, Corona, all kinds of things. Are you ready, Eric? You ready for more fun? So, yay! So, and our audience, be ready, continue to be ready. We will be coming back shortly with more interesting topics. Again, want to say thank you to our sponsor, Sahori Insurance. Thank you as always, Eric, for your insights. For more information, go to watchdiplomat.com. Be sure to subscribe so you get alerts to our next webcast. And in the meantime, everyone, stay safe. Take care.